Hello everyone, I'm Chris Krycho, and this is my On the Craft essay for October 2025 about fittingness. A few weeks ago, listening to a musical adaptation of another piece of art, and I'll leave aside the details here because they aren't particularly relevant for the rest of the essay, I was reflecting, again, on the question of fittingness. That is, whether and how the music suited the piece that was being adapted. Does it, like a piece of clothing, fit well or not? Because an ill-fitting piece of clothing can make the most attractive person look goofy or obscure their best attributes. By contrast, attire that fits well can bring out the best even in someone who might not otherwise seem that attractive. And the same, I think, is true of any artistic adaptation of one medium to another. You might consider, for example, painting a scene from a story. There are ways you could do that that would fit the story, and ways that wouldn't. And those ways would differ depending on the story in question. For example, you wouldn't paint a scene from Hamlet the same way that you would paint a scene from Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, a Shakespearean tragedy and a late 19th century satire. Nor would you paint a scene from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment the same way that you would paint a scene from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. It wouldn't be fitting to depict a Russian psychological horror the same way that you would depict a children's novel with allegorical overtures. They just don't work the same way, and you shouldn't depict them the same way. And there are many ways that you could depict either of those books, or Hamlet or Oscar Wilde, in ways that would be fitting to either. It's not a matter of medium. You could do that with oil paints, or you could perhaps do it with watercolors, or so on. But they would be different, because if you tried to paint The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Crime and Punishment the same way, one of them would not be well-fitting, and it wouldn't be, therefore, an appropriate representation of the art it was translating. These days, I most commonly encounter that distinction musically in the context of church and church music. Most contemporary church music does, frankly, a very poor job of text setting. That is, of matching the music to the text. So there are a couple common kinds of failure that I hear. One is cases where the words and the music are at odds with each other. And I like to illustrate this by talking about things like the phrase "in the highest," which shows up semi-regularly in hymns and contemporary Christian music alike. And all too often, it shows up at the bottom of a descending musical phrase, "in the highest." And I think, shouldn't that be going up instead? There's a contradiction between the musical motion and the poetic motion in the text. And then secondly, similarly, songs where you end up with melodic emphasis or prosodic emphasis, that is, the emphasis of the words within a poetic phrase, on secondary or supporting words, often on articles like or the, instead of the most important words in the sentence, the subject and the object and the verbs. And I think about this one as if you end up with a poetic phrase where you emphasize the Father of Light. Wait, what? No, the Father of Light. Those should be where the emphasis falls. And if the musical line similarly holds the rhythm out on the Father of Light, or worse, the Father of Light, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. But those kinds of things happen regularly. The music is not fitted well to the music. Now, there are times, especially in the first of those examples, where a sophisticated composer might make those kinds of moves for a specific artistic effect. You can undercut an audience's expectations as a specific musical choice to make something more interesting. So instead of getting to where the audience expects you go somewhere else. And that undercutting of expectations can make the piece more musically engaging or interesting. But as with any move that way, it only works And this is particularly true of deconstructive moves or ironizing moves. It only works if there's something to deconstruct. It only works if there's, actual irony. If there's not something to ironize effectively, but what are we even doing here? Again, something about either the text itself or the composer's intent toward the text must warrant that kind of move. If you ironize one artistic work with another, a poem with a piece of music or a book with a painting or whatever the case may be, and you don't have a particularly deft touch, and you, in particular, if you lack good judgment about when and how that's appropriate, you end up with something that really devolves into a kind of mere cynicism of using another work for your own ends without regard for the work or the artist behind it. In any case, when this shows up in church music, the authors of that church music aren't intending to ironize the texts that they're setting. Quite the contrary. Half the time, they're the authors of the texts that they're setting. No, the problem is that they're ignorant of the principles of good text setting. They're also ignorant of the principles of theology and poetry a lot of times, but we'll leave that aside because that's for some other discussion on some other YouTube channel. Here, I just want to note that setting aside my critiques of a lot of contemporary Christian music, this isn't actually a purely contemporary phenomenon. There are a lot of hymns that actually get this wrong as well, including some that we've sung for a long time. And I think this is because the more metrical texts that you see in many hymns, that is where each line has the same or a set number of syllables, the easier it is to set that to a metrical tune, where, again, the melody and harmony have a set matching number of motions that allow you to set those syllables to it. And that means that you can very easily set a text that has the right number of syllables to a musical line that gives you metrical or musical mismatch between the phrasing of the text and the phrasing of the music. Stronger poetry and richer music is not a guarantee of fittingness. In fact, it can sometimes, ironically, actually just heighten the contrast between the two because you have a strong text and a strong musical line that really don't fit each other. One thing that makes this particularly difficult to solve for as a composer, as an artist, is that there isn't a recipe. You shouldn't make a habit out of bottoming out your descending melodic material on highest or heaven or words like that. You can take as a sort of baseline heuristic, a rule of thumb, something like take your melodic and harmonic progressions in upward, ascending directions when the words suggest upward things, highest and heaven and so on. Take those melodic and harmonic progressions downward, descending when the text suggests downward motion or descent. But again, that's a rule of thumb and a heuristic that's really only a starting point. If you follow that slavishly, you won't write good music. You won't write interesting music. Instead, you'll end up in the place that a lot of modern film music does, where it doesn't say anything that the text of the film isn't already saying. Instead, it's just reiterating what is on screen and emphasizing you should feel this. The music to which we set the poetic texts of a hymn should help us to feel the hymn. Now, granted, following those rules, down with downwards, up with upwards, etc., would be better than the baseline. At least the music wouldn't totally contradict or undermine the text that it's setting. But even if we did that, there are still other questions to answer about those kinds of text. What does it make of humanity? What does it make of God? What is it saying about sin and about salvation? And how then can the music help the people singing it and hearing it? If there's a choir singing it, the congregation listening, and then especially if the congregation is singing along, feel what the text is trying to convey. That's important. That's the point of setting it to music. And in fact, that's true for all sung music to some extent. Now here, I have been speaking primarily about hymns and church music because I end up thinking about this dynamic every single week. Some song or another gives me cause. But the same thing is true of any musical setting, of any text. It's true of pop music. It's true of art music, setting some old poem. If the text is lightly ironic, you shouldn't go with sincere symphonic bombast, which doesn't mean that you can't use symphonic bombast ironically. It just means that as a composer, you would need sufficient skill and judiciousness to warrant that and to make it work so that the audience could follow, so that the audience would understand it as a sort of musical wink. This is intended to be ironic, just like the text is, in a way that might help the audience feel and follow that irony in a way they wouldn't without it. I said a moment ago, skill and judiciousness, and I think those are key ideas here, because in a real sense, skill and judiciousness are the markers for maturity in any craft. It's not specific to music. It is something that we could say equally of my day job as a software engineer. Skill and judiciousness are what make someone a mature software engineer. It goes for the fine arts too, of course, but it doesn't go only for them. And you must develop them. You must practice them. If you don't, you won't know when it's appropriate to deploy symphonic bombast ironically and when it's not. So that means that when we are in the fine arts world, we have to work hard to make sure that our adaptations are fitting, whatever it is that we're adapting from whatever medium to whatever medium. On that note, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what are some of the works that you know of, musical works that adapt texts, that adapt ideas, whatever it may be, where it is fitting, where it does get it right? What are some of the other non-musical adaptations you can think of, whether that is, as I said at the beginning, a painting trying to illuminate a moment from literature, or a film adaptation of a book, which goes wrong far more often than it goes right, or, I don't know, a poem inspired by statuary? I'd be curious to hear. Tell me what you think. Give me your feedback. I'd love to know of more examples of art that shows this kind of fittingness. Thanks for watching. Happy October. I'll be back in November with something totally different, as always. See you then.